the Consciousness Code podcast episode for Autopilot Living when habit, identity, and repetition begin living for us. Hello, and welcome back to the Consciousness Code podcast. In the last episode, we explored how the body often reacts before belief fully forms, how physiology shapes what feels true, how safety and threat alter perception, and how much of our experience is being organized before the conscious mind catches up with a neat explanation. In this episode, we widen the frame again, because if the body learns, if the mind repeats, if patterns become familiar, and if roles are reinforced often enough, then eventually something more unsettling can happen. A life can begin to run on its own surface. You can keep going. You can stay functional. You can look capable. You can say the right things, answer the right messages, perform the right role, and maintain the appearance of a coherent life. And still, from the inside, something may be strangely missing, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that always announces itself clearly, but in a quieter way, a more modern way, a more ordinary way. You are there, but not fully there. You are doing what needs to be done, but not truly inhabiting it. You are living your life, but much of that life is being carried by repetition, role, expectation, and habit, rather than direct participation. That is what this episode is about. Not simply routine in the practical sense, not just forgetting where you put your keys, or driving home automatically, or making a cup of tea without thinking. Those things are part of it, but the issue here is deeper than that. This episode is about what happens when repetition no longer supports life, but begins to replace contact with life. When adulthood becomes a performance rather than a presence. When identity becomes rehearsal. When competence hides detachment. When social roles become so familiar that we stop asking whether they still have anything to do with what is alive in us now. Because one of the strangest things about being human is that we can become highly skilled at appearing present while being inwardly absent. Often, the people around us do not see it clearly. Sometimes we don't see it clearly ourselves. That is part of what makes autopilot so powerful. It does not always feel like a collapse. It often looks like normality. It looks like responsibility. It looks like reliability. It looks like efficiency. It looks like adulthood. It looks like being someone who copes. But from the inside, it can feel like a life that keeps moving without ever properly arriving. So in this episode, I want to slow that down. I want to look at what autopilot actually is, how habit becomes identity, how performance becomes selfhood, why social life often rewards automaticity, and what it costs us when we become experts at functioning without contact. Because if the earlier episodes have shown that awareness is unstable, that the body shapes perception, and that much of what moves us happens before thought explains it, then this episode asks the next necessary question. What happens when those repeated patterns become the life we call me? That is where we're going. Into autopilot, into repetition, into the strange familiarity of a life that can be managed without being deeply lived. Perhaps, if we are honest enough with ourselves, into one of the most common forms of absence in modern life. Living a life you barely notice, there is a kind of absence that does not look like disappearance. It does not look like a collapse. It does not look like a breakdown. It does not even always look like distress. Sometimes it looks like competence. Sometimes it looks like someone is getting through the day efficiently. Someone who wakes up on time, replies to messages, gets to work, handles responsibilities, keeps the household moving, speaks politely, performs well enough in meetings, remembers enough to maintain appearances, makes the right noises in the right places, and gets through another day without anything visibly falling apart. And yet, from the inside, they may barely have been there. That is one of the strangest forms of autopilot. Not disappearing from life, but continuing to live it without fully noticing that you are no longer in contact with it. Most of us know something about this, even if we do not always use that language. We know what it is like to reach the end of a day and feel as though we have done hundreds of things, yet inhabited almost none of them. We know what it is like to move from one task to the next, one role to the next, one conversation to the next, while some deeper part of us remains unarrived, distant, or deferred. We know what it is like to be outwardly organized and inwardly vague, to be in motion all day without ever fully meeting the day. And because this is so common, we often stop seeing how strange it really is. We call it busy. We call it normal. We call it being an adult. We call it having a lot on. We call it life. But there is a difference between a full life and an inhabited one. That difference matters. Because a person can be productive without being present. They can be socially coherent without being inwardly gathered. They can be highly adapted without feeling truly alive. They can be impressive in role and absent in self. That is why the hook for this episode matters so much. What happens when you begin living a life you barely notice? Not a life you hate. Not necessarily a life you would even describe as failing. Just a life that has become so patterned, so rehearsed, so automatic that much of it now runs on familiarity rather than presence. You wake, and the body moves into sequence. You check, you answer, you prepare, you manage, you get through, you perform, you maintain, and because the sequence works well enough, nobody interrupts it. That is one of the hidden dangers of autopilot. It is often rewarded precisely because it is efficient. If your automaticity keeps you functional, others may see you as dependable. If your rehearsed self keeps the social environment smooth, others may see you as stable. If your role performance is polished, you may be praised for maturity, professionalism, resilience, composure, or strength. but none of that tells us whether you were actually there. None of it tells us whether your life is being lived from contact or merely carried by sequence. I think that is one of the hardest things to admit in modern life, that we can become very good at surviving the appearance of a life without really inhabiting its depth. You can see this in small moments first. You are halfway through a conversation and realize you have not properly heard the last minute of what was said. You nodded in the right places. You answered well enough. You were socially present in the visible sense, but inwardly your attention had drifted into planning, tension, self-management, worry, or low-grade emotional absence. The body remained. The role continued, but the living contact was thin. Or you get through a whole working day moving from task to task, and only in the evening when the noise finally lowers slightly, do you notice that you have not actually checked in with yourself once. Not once. You have solved things, answered people, met expectations, and carried your responsibilities. Yet there has been almost no real pause in which your life felt directly inhabited from the inside. Or you spend time with people you care about, and afterwards there is a strange ache, not because anything went badly, but because some part of you knows you were performing connection more than truly entering it. You smiled, spoke, asked questions, and kept the shape of intimacy intact, but there was a distance you never crossed. You were there in body, there in role, there in expression perhaps, but not fully there in contact. Those moments matter because they reveal something uncomfortable but common. A great deal of life can be lived through momentum, and momentum is not the same as presence. Momentum carries. Presence inhabits. Momentum keeps the sequence going. Presence allows experience to be lived. Momentum maintains continuity. Presence creates contact. The problem is that many of us have been trained socially and psychologically to value continuity over contact, to value keeping things going over truly arriving in them, to value looking stable over feeling alive, and over time that creates a strange kind of adaptation. We become experts in proceeding. We know how to keep the script moving, how to stay in role, how to maintain the expected version of ourselves, how to produce the right emotional signals for the environment, how to keep functioning even when inwardly detached, and because that skill is useful, it can become hard to question. In fact, for many people, questioning it feels threatening, because if you stop long enough to notice how absent you have become, then other questions begin to rise. What am I actually feeling? What do I really want? When did I start living like this? How much of what I call my life is just repetition? How much of what I call me is role, habit, adaptation, and expectation? Those are not light questions. So for many of us, the easier move is to keep going, and that is why autopilot can become not just a practical mode, but a psychological shelter, a way of not having to confront how distant we may have become from ourselves. This is especially true in adulthood, because adulthood often brings structure, demand, repetition, and role pressure all at once. You do not just have feelings, you have responsibilities. You do not just have inner conflict, you still have to show up. You still have to manage work, family, relationships, money, schedules, obligations, health, messages, deadlines, appearances, and practical life. So it becomes very easy to build an identity around coping. The one who handles things, the one who gets on with it, the one who does what needs to be done, the one who does not make life difficult for others, the one who keeps moving, and again, none of that is false. It may even be admirable in many ways, but if coping becomes the whole shape of the self, something else often gets pushed further and further into the background, direct participation in life. And that is where the real sorrow of autopilot begins, not when life becomes hard, but when life becomes efficient enough to continue without you fully meeting it, when your routines become so rehearsed that they no longer require presence, when your conversations become so patterned that they no longer require honesty, when your identity becomes so well managed that spontaneity starts to feel unfamiliar, when your life is functioning but your aliveness inside it is fading. That does not usually happen all at once. It happens gradually, a little more speed, a little less noticing, a little more repetition, a little less inward contact, a little more role, a little less reality, until one day, perhaps quietly, you realize that you have become very skilled at maintaining a life you are no longer fully inhabiting. That realization can feel heavy, but it can also be the beginning of something important, because the moment you notice autopilot is no longer total. The moment you can say, I have been here, but not really here, something opens. Not everything, not instantly, but something. Awareness enters the groove. The sequence is interrupted, even slightly, and what had become invisible begins, at last, to become readable. That is where this episode begins in earnest, with the recognition that one of the most common forms of absence is not disappearing from life, but continuing to live it without truly noticing that you have left the room inwardly. And once that becomes visible, the next question naturally follows. What exactly is autopilot? And how does it take hold so quietly that we start calling it normal? What is autopilot? Autopilot is not just a habit. It is not only brushing your teeth without thinking, taking the same road home, or making coffee from muscle memory. Those are ordinary forms of automaticity, and in many ways they are useful. Repetition reduces effort. Familiarity lowers cognitive load. As Benjamin Gardner argued in 2012, habit is one of the mind's great labor-saving mechanisms. Repeated behavior in stable contexts becomes increasingly automatic, and more recent work by Singh and colleagues in 2024 supports that broader pattern, showing how repeated action in consistent settings gradually shifts behavior away from deliberate effort and towards automatic execution. So the problem is not that automaticity exists. The problem begins when automaticity spreads too far, when it moves beyond useful routine and starts shaping how we relate, how we perform identity, how we cope, how we speak, how we stay distant, how we stay functional, how we stay acceptable, how we stay moving. At that point, autopilot is no longer just a practical convenience. It becomes a way of life. That is where something more unsettling begins to happen. A life can start looking intentional from the outside while being largely automatic from within. You can still function. You can still answer. You can still work. You can still cope. You can still meet expectations. You can still look reliable, composed, and socially coherent, and still, inwardly, much of that life may be running on repetition rather than contact. That is what I mean here by autopilot. Not simply repeated behavior, but repeated ways of being, repeated emotional postures, repeated identity performances, repeated reactions, repeated self-descriptions, repeated forms of competence, and repeated distance. These repeated patterns are often rewarded. They stop feeling like patterns. They begin to feel like a personality, like maturity, like adulthood, like just who I am. That is one reason this subject matters so much, because many of us are not only living through habits, we are living through behavioral grooves that have become selfhood by repetition. Research supports this in different ways. Rehearsed and colleagues in 2017 found that people vary in their proneness to habit, routine, and automatic responding, which matters because it suggests some of us become more strongly organized around behavioral repetition than others. That does not mean we are trapped by it forever, but it does mean automaticity is not distributed evenly. Some people slide into grooves more easily. Some become more identity-bound through routine than others. But autopilot is not only about efficiency, it is also about protection. That is where the subject deepens. Because when people think about automaticity, they often think in behavioral terms only. They think of routines, cue-response learning, procedural memory, and familiar acts repeated often enough to no longer need full attention. But much of what becomes automatic in us is not only action. It is a state. It is a stance. It is how we become agreeable, how we become distant, how we become capable, how we become the strong one, the calm one, the funny one, the useful one, the spiritual one, the one who does not need much, the one who keeps the peace, the one who gets on with it. In other words, the self can become procedural, not false exactly, but rehearsed. Once that happens, autopilot starts overlapping with dissociation. Now that word needs care. Not every routine is dissociation. Not every absent feeling day is clinical dissociation. But dissociation, broadly speaking, does involve some breakdown or distancing in the integration of experience. Distancing from feeling, from bodily immediacy, from memory, from continuity, or from the felt reality of the moment. Boyer and colleagues in 2022 described trauma-related dissociation as a disruption in the integration of consciousness, memory, identity, emotion, perception, and bodily experience. Murphy and colleagues in 2023 described depersonalization and derealization in terms of detachment, unreality, and hypoemotionality, states in which life can continue externally while inward immediacy becomes strangely thin. That matters because dissociation is often imagined too dramatically. People think of it only in extreme terms, but often it is quieter than that. Sometimes it looks like functioning beautifully while feeling strangely absent. Sometimes it looks like speaking fluently while not fully feeling what you are saying. Sometimes it looks like getting through an entire day while barely contacting yourself once. Sometimes it looks like being socially appropriate while inwardly far away. Sometimes it looks like competence without aliveness. Dissociation is often discussed as a safety response to a threat. That is true, but it is not the whole story. The preservation of life is one part of the picture, but what many people are protecting is not only the body in the immediate physical sense. Sometimes what is being protected is coherence, sometimes attachment, sometimes identity, sometimes the ability to keep functioning, sometimes the ability to remain acceptable in an environment that does not feel safe enough for full presence. That is why many people dissociate not only in obvious danger, but in overload, contradiction, shame, emotional saturation, relational conflict, and environments where feeling fully would make performance impossible. Harriet Maitland and colleagues in 2024 linked shame processes to dissociation, which is important because shame is not simply fear of physical injury. It is fear of exposure, humiliation, collapse of social standing, and collapse of self-worth. Burbach and colleagues in 2024 also linked recurrent dissociative symptoms to insecure attachment, maladaptive coping, and difficulties in emotional integration. So when people go blank, flatten, detach, overfunction, or become strangely absent, what is being defended may not be survival in the narrow physical sense alone. It may be the preservation of a workable self. That is a very important distinction. Preservation of life is one layer. Preservation of role is another. Preservation of attachment is another. Preservation of identity is another. Preservation of emotional manageability is another. So if someone shuts down in conflict, that may not mean they are choosing distance in any fully conscious way. It may mean their system has learned that full presence in conflict is overwhelming. If someone keeps performing adulthood while feeling absent inside, that may not mean they are shallow or lazy. It may mean adaptation has become so dominant that it now runs like identity. That is what makes autopilot more than a mere habit. It becomes an organized absence, and once we see that, another question naturally follows. If so much of this is shaped by fear protection and learned response, why isn't everyone equally fearful? Why do some people seem almost fearless? That question matters because it keeps us from oversimplifying the mind. Fear sensitivity varies. Resilience varies. Risk tolerance varies. Reward sensitivity varies. Temperament varies. Learning history varies. Secure attachment and chronic unpredictability do not produce the same system. Repeated success under challenge does not produce the same system as repeated humiliation under exposure. As Grogan's and colleagues argued in 2023, fear and anxiety are not one simple switch. They involve multiple systems shaped by biology, context, and learning. White and colleagues in 2017 discussed fearlessness as a variable trait in healthy populations, rather than as a simple pathology. Walters and colleagues in 2015 found associations between fearlessness traits and reduced amygdala volume in their sample, while Kerr and colleagues in 2012 reviewed how psychopathic traits may involve atypical threat and reward processing. But fearless is not one thing. Some people are genuinely more regulated. Some are more sensation-seeking. Some are less threat-sensitive. Some are better practiced. Some have developed real resilience. Some are defended in a way that mimics courage. Some are dissociated enough that they do not feel the danger fully. Some are simply organized around reward more strongly than caution. So when someone appears fearless, that does not always mean freedom. Sometimes it means secure regulation. Sometimes trained composure. Sometimes bravado. Sometimes under-detection of the threat. Sometimes emotional numbing. Sometimes a different nervous system baseline entirely. That matters because many of us compare ourselves unfairly. We imagine other people are simply stronger when sometimes they are just differently organized. And this becomes especially visible in gendered role performance. Many men are trained to convert fear into control, certainty, humor, silence, or aggression. Many women are trained to convert fear into pleasing, softening, accommodating, smoothing, emotional overreading, or self-monitoring. Neither is true freedom. Both can become automatic adaptations. Both can become identity. Both can become autopilot. That is why mental resilience needs to be understood carefully, too. Resilience is not usually the absence of fear. It is not just fearlessness. More often, it is the capacity to recover, integrate, and remain flexible under pressure. It is the ability to feel activation without becoming wholly governed by it. Recent work by Mancini and colleagues in 2025 and Tenblanco and colleagues in 2025 suggests that fear extinction and resilience vary significantly between people. Some systems update more easily after a challenge. Others remain stickier, more anticipatory, more difficult to reorient. That means autopilot develops differently in different people. For one person, it becomes hyperfunctioning. For another, it becomes numbness. For another, it becomes emotional control. For another, it becomes chronic accommodation. For another, it becomes a work addiction. For another, it becomes a polished detachment. For another, it becomes apparently fearless risk-taking that is not courage, but blunted caution. What all of these forms share is not one outward behavior. What they share is that some repeated adaptation has become stronger than fresh, conscious participation. That is what autopilot really is. It is repeated learning hardened into style. It is an adaptation rehearsed until it feels like selfhood. It is a function carried by sequence more than contact. It is the self becoming over-organized around what has worked often enough to stop being questioned. And that is why becoming conscious of autopilot can feel destabilizing, because you are not only questioning a few habits, you are questioning the scaffolding of the self. You are asking, what in me is truly alive now? What in me is only well rehearsed? What in me is chosen? What in me is adaptive? What in me still belongs to an older world? What in me has become so familiar that I keep calling it me without noticing whether I am fully there inside it? Those are not small questions, but they are necessary ones, because until we ask them, we will keep calling repetition identity, coping presence, and automaticity adulthood. We will keep mistaking the fact that a life is functioning for the truth that it is being consciously lived. Perhaps that is one of the deepest recognitions in this whole episode. Autopilot is not simply the mind doing less work. It is often the self doing less inhabiting. That is why it can look so normal from the outside and feel so empty from within. Habit versus conscious participation. One of the most important distinctions in this whole episode is the difference between doing something repeatedly and actually inhabiting it consciously, because repetition on its own is not the problem. We need repetition. We need rhythms. We need learned sequences. We need patterns that reduce unnecessary effort. We need forms of stability that stop life from becoming one long improvisation. If every small action demanded full deliberation, most of us would be exhausted before midday. So habit in itself is not the enemy. Habit can support life. It can protect energy. It can create structure. It can make certain kinds of care possible. Good habits can hold us up when motivation is low. They can carry us through difficult periods. They can support health, discipline, relationships, work, and recovery. So this section is not about condemning the habit. It is about asking a deeper question. At what point does repetition stop supporting conscious life and begin replacing conscious life? That is where things get more subtle, because habits are built gradually. They do not usually announce themselves as an identity. They begin as repeated responses to repeated circumstances. You do something once, then again under similar conditions. The body learns the sequence. The mind stops needing to fully examine each step. Familiarity lowers effort. Repetition creates fluency. What once required active participation begins to require less of it. That is useful in some areas. But the more something is repeated, the easier it becomes for it to stop feeling like a pattern and start feeling like reality. That is where behavioral grooves form. A groove is not just a habit. It is a pathway worn by enough repetition that you begin sliding into it with very little friction. A groove carries momentum. It is easier to fall into than to step outside of. And because it is easier, many of us stop noticing that we are entering it at all. You wake, and the same inner pace begins. You get ready, and the same emotional posture arrives. You go to work, and the same role takes over. You speak to certain people, and the same version of yourself appears. You feel discomfort, and the same response rises almost automatically. You encounter uncertainty, and the same type of meaning rushes in. Over time, these grooves become normal enough that they no longer feel like repeated decisions. They feel like just how things are, or just how I am, or just what life is like. And once that happens, familiarity starts doing something dangerous. It stops us from questioning our own lives. That is one of the hidden powers of repetition. It not only creates efficiency, it creates invisibility. The more often something is done, the less strange it seems. The less strange it seems, the less likely we are to examine it. And the less we examine it, the more it begins to live through us unquestioned. This is why daily routines matter so much. Not because routine is bad, but because routine becomes the architecture of ordinary life. The way you wake, the speed you move at, the first thing you reach for, the quality of attention you bring to the morning, the pace of your working day, the way you transition between tasks, the way you recover, all of this shapes not only what you do, but how you are. A routine can support consciousness. It can create steadiness. It can create room. It can help the body feel safer. It can reduce chaos. It can support reflection and regulation. But a routine can also become so automatic that it carries you straight past yourself. You wake and reach for the phone before you have even inhabited your own body. You move immediately into doing before any contact with what you feel. You become efficient at starting the day without ever arriving at it. And because this happens every morning, it stops feeling like a choice. That is the subtle cost of habit without attention. The same is true of work cycles. Work, perhaps more than anything else in modern life, trains automaticity. It trains speed, response patterns, role consistency, image management, timing, productivity rhythms, professional language, and identity through repetition. None of that is inherently wrong. Work often requires reliability. It often requires sequences and standards. But the longer you live inside those sequences, the easier it becomes for work patterns to spread into the whole self. You stop only when the system stops you. You answer before you feel. You stay in output mode long after the workday is done. You become someone who manages, replies, performs, and proceeds. And all of that can happen while the inner life grows thinner and thinner, because work habits do not remain at work alone. They become ways of being, the person who is always on, the person who cannot soften, the person who struggles to be with unstructured time, the person who treats rest as inefficiency, the person who remains mentally in task mode even in intimacy. Again, that is not because work is evil. It is because repeated patterns become transferable. They begin in one area and then spread. The same is true of health habits. We often speak about health habits as if they are obviously positive, and often they are. Sleeping well, moving regularly, eating with some care, breathing more consciously, building routines that support recovery. These can all genuinely support life. But even here, repetition can drift in two directions. A health habit can support contact, or it can become another form of automatic control. You can move your body and actually inhabit it, or you can exercise compulsively while remaining inwardly disconnected. You can eat with awareness, or you can build rigid food patterns that are more about anxiety management than nourishment. You can rest, or you can perform wellness while never truly relaxing. So even the so-called good habits need to be examined at the level of participation. Am I actually here in this, or am I simply repeating a system that now runs on its own logic? That question matters in relationships too, because relational life is full of habits. There are habits of speaking, habits of withholding, habits of apologizing too early, habits of over-explaining, habits of avoiding conflict, habits of escalating quickly, habits of caretaking, habits of withdrawing, habits of humor, habits of silence, habits of anticipating disappointment, habits of reading too much into tone, habits of not saying what we really mean. The more often a relational habit is repeated, the more it begins to feel like chemistry, personality, or destiny. But often it is a groove, not false exactly, but grooved. Someone may believe they are just bad at intimacy, when in fact they have repeated withdrawal so often that closeness now activates a familiar exit sequence. Someone may believe they are just very independent, when in fact dependence has long been associated with vulnerability or disappointment. Someone may believe they are just easygoing, when in fact they have repeated self-silencing so often that they barely recognize their own resistance anymore. That is what repetition does when it hardens into style. It turns a pattern into a self-description, and perhaps nowhere is this more powerful than with emotional habits, because most of us do not only have behavioral routines, we also have repeated ways of feeling, repeated ways of bracing, repeated ways of anticipating, repeated ways of collapsing, repeated ways of hardening, repeated ways of minimizing pain, repeated ways of escalating discomfort into certainty, repeated ways of soothing, controlling, avoiding, or numbing. Over time, these emotional habits can become the atmosphere through which life is lived. A person may become accustomed to low-grade anxiety and call it normal. Another may become accustomed to emotional detachment and call it maturity. Another may become accustomed to irritability and call it directness. Another may become accustomed to overfunctioning and call it strength. This is why familiarity is not a reliable guide to health. What is familiar may simply be what has been repeated longest, and that matters especially in patterned responses to discomfort. Because discomfort is one of the great organizers of autopilot. Most of us have some automatic relationship to it. Some move toward control, some toward distraction, some toward food, some toward productivity, some toward explanation, some are toward withdrawal, some toward soothing others, some toward numbing, some toward humor, some toward anger, some toward collapse. And the more often discomfort is met in the same way, the stronger that groove becomes. Eventually, the response may begin before the discomfort is even fully conscious. That is when habit stops looking like habit and starts looking like character. But if we slow this down enough, we start to see the deeper distinction at the center of this section. A habit can support life, or it can begin replacing direct participation in life. That is the line we have to keep returning to, because not all repetition is deadening. Some repetition is actually what makes a deeper life possible. A regular walk, regular sleep, regular reflection, regular forms of care, regular truth-telling, regular practices that stabilize the body and mind. These can create the conditions for greater presence. But repetition becomes costly when it replaces questioning, when it replaces contact, when it replaces aliveness, when it becomes the thing that decides in our place. And often we do not notice that shift until we begin to feel numb, trapped, or strangely absent in a life that appears perfectly functional. That is when people start saying things like, "I don't know what's wrong. Everything is fine, but I feel disconnected. I've built a life that works, but I don't feel in it. I keep doing the same things, and I don't know if they still mean anything. I feel like I'm living for other people rather than for myself." Those are not small statements. They are often signs that repetition has moved from support into substitution. Support says, "This helps me live." Substitution says, "This is living for me now." And once repetition begins living for you, self-questioning becomes harder, because behavioral grooves resist interruption, not dramatically, but quietly. They pull you toward the known. They reward continuation. They reduce friction around the familiar. They make alternatives feel effortful, uncertain, and strange. That is why change can feel so difficult, even when the pattern is no longer serving you. It is not only because you lack willpower, it is because the groove is smooth, and consciousness takes energy. To step out of repetition requires noticing. To notice requires presence. To sustain presence in the face of discomfort requires more than a good idea. It requires a different relationship to habit itself, not total rejection, not chaos, not trying to live without rhythm, but a more honest discernment. Which habits support being alive? Which habits deaden it? Which routines create room? Which routines carry me past myself? Which forms of repetition help me arrive? Which forms help me avoid arriving? Those are the kinds of questions that begin to loosen autopilot, because once a groove is recognized, it is no longer fully invisible. Once repetition becomes visible as repetition, even for a moment, a little space appears, and in that space, conscious participation can begin to return, not all at once, not dramatically, but enough to make a difference. Enough to notice that the morning has a feel to it before the sequence takes over. Enough to notice that a familiar argument begins in the same place each time. Enough to notice that your body moves toward a coping pattern before you have chosen it. Enough to notice that what you call identity may partly be memorized behavior. This is where habit becomes a serious spiritual, psychological, and existential subject. Because the question is no longer just, what do I do every day? It becomes, what is my daily life doing to my feelings and thoughts of being alive? What in me is being strengthened by repetition? What in me is being dulled? What in me is being supported? What in me is being replaced? And perhaps that is the real task of this section, not to make you suspicious of all routine, but to make you more intimate with the difference between repetition that supports life and repetition that slowly becomes a substitute for living. That is the line, and once you start seeing it, you cannot entirely unsee it. You begin to recognize when your routines are carrying you and when they are carrying you away. Performance, role, and identity repetition at a certain point, autopilot stops being just something we do. It starts becoming someone we are, not in the deepest sense, not in the sense of what is most alive in us, but in the social sense, in the visible sense, in the repeated sense, and that is where this part of the episode really begins, with the recognition that identity is often rehearsed. Most of us do not simply have roles. We are shaped by them. We repeat them. We inhabit them so often that they begin to feel natural, inevitable, and personal. The self becomes familiar through performance. As Irving Goffman argued in the presentation of self in Everyday Life in 1959, much of social life can be understood as performance, impression management, and role maintenance. We do not walk into every room as some untouched inner essence. We arrive already adjusting to the audience, context, expectation, and position. We become legible to others by presenting a version of ourselves, and if that presentation is repeated often enough, it begins to harden into identity. That does not mean identity is fake. It means identity is partly social, partly embodied, partly remembered, partly repeated, partly performed, and that is important because many of us still imagine the self as something private and self-contained, as though who I am exists fully formed somewhere underneath social life and merely gets expressed. But phenomenological approaches to self-consciousness, especially those associated with Sean Gallagher, argue something subtler. Self-experience is always shaped by embodiment and by others. The self is not built outside the social world and then brought into it. It is formed in relation through exposure, recognition, language, roles, mirroring, and public life. Maurice Merleau-Ponty made a similar point more broadly when he insisted that consciousness is inseparable from the body and the world. So when we talk about performance, we are not talking about something separate from selfhood. We are talking about one of the ways selfhood becomes organized. This becomes very obvious in workplace identity. Most people know what it is like to enter a professional role and feel some version of the self come forward almost automatically. The competent one, the calm one, the reliable one, the one who knows what to say, what not to say, when to smile, when to keep things brief, when to soften, when to appear certain, when to conceal uncertainty. Again, none of this is necessarily false or unhealthy. Social life needs some coherence. Work would become chaotic without a role structure. But role structure comes with a cost if it is lived too continuously. The more often a version of the self is rewarded, the easier it becomes to confuse role competence with inner wholeness. A person can become excellent at being the professional self and still feel increasingly estranged from whatever in them is not efficient, coherent, useful, or presentable. That is one of the hidden sorrows of performative adulthood. We become good at being manageable, good at being reliable, good at being emotionally legible, good at carrying pressure without visibly breaking form, good at speaking in ways that preserve social continuity, and because the world rewards that, we begin to trust it. But there can be a deep distance between role competence and inner aliveness. That distance shows up in family roles too. The strong one, the calm one, the caretaker, the responsible one, the one who doesn't need much, the one who always smooths things over, the one who brings humor, the one who can be leaned on, the rational one, the spiritual one. These are not just labels. They are repeated emotional positions. They become expected by others, but they are also reinforced internally. Each role solves something. Each role protects something. Each role stabilizes a certain relational order. The caretaker may preserve attachment by staying useful. The strong one may preserve dignity by never appearing overwhelmed. The calm one may preserve safety by suppressing disruption. The funny one may preserve belonging by transmuting vulnerability into charm. The rational one may preserve self-respect by staying above emotional exposure. The spiritual one may preserve coherence by turning suffering into elevated language before it has actually been lived through. Again, the issue is not that these roles are entirely false. The issue is over-identification. Once a role is repeated long enough, it stops feeling like a role. It begins to feel like essence, and this is where neuroscience becomes relevant. Recent work on self-referential processing suggests that the self is not a single simple structure in the brain, but a dynamic process involving multiple forms of integration. Research published in 2023 and 2024 repeatedly points to the medial prefrontal cortex, among other regions, as being involved in self-referential processing, self-concept, and the integration of personally salient information. In other words, the self we experience is not just there. It is continually being assembled, reinforced, and updated, or not updated, in relation to what matters to us, what gets repeated, and what becomes personally important. The more often a version of the self is rehearsed, emotionally reinforced, and socially rewarded, the more deeply it may become encoded as me. That helps explain why roles are so hard to loosen, not because they are superficial, but because they are biologically and socially reinforced. A role is not only an idea, it becomes a pattern of attention, a pattern of emotion, a pattern of expectation, a pattern of bodily readiness, a pattern of memory, a pattern of self-reference. This is also where neurophysiology matters. Repeated social roles are not just stored as abstract beliefs, they become embodied. The body learns how to stand in that role, how to speak from it, how to pace from it, how to breathe from it, how to suppress from it, how to brace from it. A person does not merely think themselves into the strong one or the caretaker. The whole organism learns the shape. That is part of what embodied cognition is trying to tell us. Cognition is deeply dependent on the body, not merely housed inside it. Who we become is not just a set of thoughts about ourselves. It is enacted, and that is why it can be so difficult to distinguish identity from repetition. Because repetition feels natural. The role becomes familiar. The familiarity becomes comfort, or duty, or necessity, or just who I am. Yet many of us know, at least in flashes, that there is a difference between the socially recognizable self and the inwardly felt self. You can feel it when you leave a room and realize you were on. You can feel it when everyone around you thinks you are coping, and some quieter part of you knows you were performing. You can feel it when you hear yourself saying the right things in the right voice while feeling strangely absent behind the words. You can feel it when your role is functioning perfectly, but something living in you has gone dim. This is where performative adulthood deserves deeper scrutiny. Modern adulthood often rewards identity as consistency. Be reliable, be coherent, be self-controlled, be manageable, be predictable enough to trust, stable enough to work with, and fluent enough to narrate yourself. The pressure to become a socially legible self is enormous. The more complex modern life becomes, the more it seems to require a person who can package themselves clearly enough to survive it. So people become branded versions of themselves, not always literally, but functionally. They become the version that works, the version that gets selected, the version that keeps the peace, the version that sustains the relationship, the version that can survive the workplace, the version that can belong in the family system, the version that looks emotionally intelligent, strong, grounded, witty, independent, evolved, or whatever else the local environment rewards. Over time, the gap between social manageability and inner truth can widen. This is not new, exactly. Goffman saw something like this in the dramaturgical character of Social Life. But today, the issue may be amplified because identity is not only performed in physical rooms. It is curated across digital environments, professional networks, intimacy scripts, therapeutic language, and self-branding culture. A person can now maintain not just a role, but an entire distributed identity system. The risk is not only dishonesty, it is estrangement. The more we live as a managed self, the easier it becomes to lose contact with what is not easily marketable, not easily legible, not easily role stable. That includes grief, ambivalence, confusion, dependency, unfinishedness, inconsistency, need, desire, the parts of us that do not fit the brand. This is where integrative philosophy becomes important. Phenomenology reminds us that selfhood is not merely a public performance, but a lived first-person reality. Yet social theory reminds us that this first-person reality is not formed outside relation. Neuroscience reminds us that self-referential processing is dynamic and plastic, not fixed once and for all. Neurobiology reminds us that repeated emotional and behavioral patterns become embodied and efficient. Evolutionary theory reminds us that adaptation to social life is not optional for a deeply social species like ours. Each perspective sees something real. The danger comes when any one of them is taken in isolation. Evolutionary theory, for example, helps us understand why performance matters so much to us at all. We are an intensely social species. Our survival historically depended not only on individual strength, but on belonging, signaling, alliance, pair bonding, kinship coordination, and reputation. John Grind argued in 2024 that social life is central to human evolution, not peripheral to it. Without social bonding, language, science, and technology would not have emerged in the way they did. In other words, managing ourselves socially is not some modern corruption layered on top of an otherwise solitary creature. It is deeply rooted in what we are. That helps explain why we adapt so quickly to role expectations. We are built for co-regulation, signaling, and social learning. We watch, we imitate, we conform, we internalize, and here animals can teach us something too. Animals also adapt socially. They develop rank-sensitive behavior, affiliative strategies, avoidance patterns, bonding rituals, and context-dependent displays. Recent work on social learning and conformity in animals argues that conformity has larger adaptive social benefits than previously thought, and modeling work on animal friendship published in PNAS in 2024 suggests that social bonding and helping can emerge through repeated, interactive dynamics rather than abstract reasoning alone. There is also growing work on the self in non-human animals, suggesting that forms of selfhood may be more multidimensional than older models assumed. Animals, too, inhabit patterns, roles, and social learning systems. But humans differ in important ways. We do not just adapt socially, we narrate adaptation. We reflect on roles. We rehearse them symbolically. We carry them across time through language, memory, and imagination. We build cultures around them. We institutionalize them. We moralize them. We aestheticize them. We internalize them as identity. As Stephen Brown argued in 2025, role-playing itself may have had an underappreciated place in human evolution and cultural transmission. That is a fascinating thought because it suggests that performance is not simply a falsehood. It may be part of how culture itself is learned, stabilized, and transmitted. Humans may be unique not because we perform and animals do not, but because our performances become elaborated into symbolic systems so complex that they can eclipse the living self underneath them. So what can we learn from this comparison? Perhaps that adaptation is natural, but over-identification is costly. Animals adapt, but they do not appear to build elaborate ideological brands around their roles. They do not produce linked-in versions of the self. They do not usually rehearse moralist autobiographies about being the calm one, the rational one, or the evolved one. Human beings do. Our extraordinary social intelligence comes with an extraordinary capacity to become estranged through image. That is why this section matters so much, because once we understand that identity is partly performed, we can begin asking a deeper question. Where has performance become stronger than presence? Where am I not just occupying a role, but being occupied by it? Where has a socially useful self become more familiar than a living one? Where do people meet my persona more often than they meet me? Where do I meet my persona more often than I meet myself? These are not accusations, they are invitations, because the answer is not to abandon all roles. That would be impossible. We need some continuity. We need some social coherence. We need some stable ways of moving through the world. The problem is not the role itself. The problem is forgetting that a role is a role. The problem begins when the strong one cannot stop being strong, when the caretaker cannot feel what they need, when the rational one cannot remain human in uncertainty, when the independent one cannot receive, when the spiritual one cannot descend into ordinary pain without translating it too quickly, when the funny one cannot stay with grief long enough for it to become real, when the calm one is calm only because they have exiled their own fire. The role has become repetitive. Repetition has become selfhood, and selfhood has become increasingly estranged from direct contact. That is the distance this part of the episode is trying to make visible, the distance between being socially coherent and being inwardly alive. And that distance is one of the central costs of autopilot living, because once identity is managed well enough, competence can conceal absence for a very long time, until perhaps quietly something in us begins to ask, who am I when the role loosens? Who am I when the audience changes? Who am I when I stop rehearsing? Who am I when repetition stops speaking in my name? That is not an easy question, but it may be one of the most necessary ones in a world that increasingly rewards presentation over presence. Why social life rewards automaticity? One of the reasons autopilot becomes so powerful is that it is not only personal, it is social, it is reinforced, rewarded, stabilized, and often quietly admired. Because modern life does not usually reward the deepest version of us. It rewards the most legible version, the version that is understandable, predictable, reliable, role-stable, and easy to place. In that sense, society often rewards what is coherent from the outside, even when it is inwardly disconnected. That is important to say plainly. A person can be praised for functioning while being far from themselves, praised for coping while inwardly detached, praised for composure while emotionally numb, praised for professionalism while privately exhausted, praised for being good with people while living through continuous self-suppression. Because these forms of automaticity are rewarded, they stop feeling like adaptation and start feeling like adulthood. That is one reason social life so often maintains autopilot. It rewards speed, reply quickly, recover quickly, understand quickly, adapt quickly, produce quickly, move on quickly, and speed changes consciousness. The faster a life moves, the less room there often is for direct contact. There is less room to feel what is happening before responding, less room to notice tension before it becomes tone, less room to let ambiguity remain open, less room to say, I need a moment to understand what is happening in me before I give you the polished version of myself. So people learn to become smooth. Professionalism, in many settings, is one of the most socially rewarded forms of smoothness. At its best, professionalism can mean care, steadiness, respect, reliability, and appropriate boundaries. But it also has a shadow side. As Zhang argued in 2025 in his work on what he calls the professionalism trap, involuntary professionalism can increase self-control demands, reduce inspiration, and create internal strain when people must sustain a certain image, even when it no longer reflects their deeper state. In other words, professionalism can become not just a standard of behavior, but a form of managed selfhood. That managed selfhood is often rewarded more than actual inward presence. You do not need to be deeply gathered. You need to look composed. You do not need to feel fully aligned. You need to be dependable. You do not need to be in living contact with your own experience. You need to remain coherent enough for the system to keep moving. And in many workplaces, that is exactly what people become skilled at. They manage expression. They manage tone. They manage emotion. They manage the appearance of being fine. They manage what can be shown, what must be hidden, and what kind of self is professionally acceptable. This is where emotional labor becomes crucial. Barley Hochschild's work in 1983 remains essential because she showed that many jobs do not simply demand physical effort or cognitive effort, but emotional performance, the managed display of feeling in line with institutional expectations. More recently, Groth and colleagues in 2024 showed that social roles at work shape affect regulation directly, influencing which emotional strategies people use and how those strategies affect well-being. Emotional labor is not just something extra added on top of the work. In many professions, it is part of the work. That means many people spend years becoming experts at seeming present while inwardly detached. They learn how to sound warm while feeling flat, how to stay polite while carrying resentment, how to remain composed while inwardly overloaded, how to smile while not being okay, how to reassure others while their own body is running on empty. And because this is socially legible and professionally useful, it is often interpreted as maturity. But maturity and managed dissociation are not the same thing. Politeness scripts work similarly. Much of social life is maintained through rituals of manageable exchange. I'm good, all fine, no worries, just busy, can't complain, it's all under control. None of these is necessarily a lie, but many of them are forms of social compression. They keep the interaction moving. They preserve order. They stop the wider field from becoming unpredictable. They allow people to remain in their role rather than entering direct contact. Again, there is a function to that. Not every setting can hold total honesty. Not every interaction should become emotionally expansive. We do need social lubrication. But once politeness becomes the dominant language of existence, something else happens. A person can remain publicly functional and privately absent for a very long time. That gap is reinforced by approval. Social systems often prefer consistency to authenticity. Consistency is easier to organize around, easier to trust in the short term, easier to predict, easier to reward. Authenticity, by contrast, is messier. It changes. It includes uncertainty. It can be inconvenient. It may require pauses, revisions, mismatches, slower truth, unfinished feeling. Many systems do not know what to do with that, so they reward the more stable substitute, role consistency. This can be seen very clearly in the performance of masculinity and femininity. Many men are rewarded for appearing self-contained, certain, emotionally controlled, stoic, decisive, and untroubled by vulnerability. As Van Laar and colleagues argued in 2024, restrictive masculine role expectations do not only harm women or broader gender relations, they also impose high mental and relational costs on men themselves. Similar organizational work in 2025 argued that masculinity is not only a source of advantage, but a system of expectations that can impose psychological burdens. The strong one is often socially rewarded long before he is inwardly free. Many women, meanwhile, are often rewarded for being emotionally fluent, relationally attuned, agreeable, socially graceful, self-monitoring, and capable of carrying effective tension without visibly rupturing the field. The 2025 review in Human Relations on Work and Femininities pointed to the ongoing force of gendered expectations in shaping what kinds of emotional and interpersonal performance are considered appropriate for women at work. So what appears as personality is often partly role compliance. Neither of these scripts is a true presence. They are socially reinforced forms of legibility, and because they are repeated, they begin to feel like identity rather than performance. That is one reason many people become fine in public and absent in private. Public life rewards the role. Private life receives the cost. In public, the person remains usable. In private, they may collapse, numb, overscroll, overwork, overeat, overthink, or simply feel strangely gone. This split is not accidental. It is built into systems that reward image management and emotional regulation more than inward integration. Even studies on organizational support and emotional labor published in 2025 continue to show how emotional regulation at work is shaped by institutional expectations and professional identity rather than emerging purely from inner freedom. There is also a broader cultural layer here. Digital life intensifies this. Social media and networked visibility encourage people to become branded versions of themselves, not just at work but everywhere. Research on micro-celebrity and status performance in 2024 showed how self-presentation becomes tied to stress, ongoing self-monitoring, and image management under audience pressure. Even when the audience is small, the self can become something maintained rather than inhabited. So when we ask why social life rewards automaticity, the answer is not simply that society is cruel. It is that systems need legibility. They need you to be recognizable enough to organize around, stable enough to predict, role consistent enough to trust, manageable enough not to disrupt the flow too often. That means deeply conscious people who pause, feel fully, revise honestly, question their roles, and refuse to reduce themselves to functional presentation can actually be harder for systems to organize, not because they are wrong, but because they are less automatic. So the pressure is always there to become simpler, faster, cleaner, more stable, and more role-bound than reality actually is. That is why social order is often maintained through repeated selfhood, the same tone, the same role, the same emotional script, the same public face, the same self-presentation, and over time, the repetition becomes socially real. People stop relating to the living person and start relating to the performance. Sometimes the performer forgets the difference too. That is the core insight of this section. Society often rewards what is legible, reliable, and role-stable even when it is inwardly disconnected. And once you see that so much of modern life becomes easier to understand, why competence can hide emptiness, why politeness can hide absence, why consistency can hide suppression, why role success can coexist with inner estrangement. Why did many of us become experts at seeming present long before we learned how to actually arrive? That recognition matters because once autopilot is seen not only as a personal habit, but as social reinforcement, the question changes. It is no longer only, why am I like this? It becomes, what kind of world taught me to become this manageable version of myself? That is a much deeper question. It brings us closer to the true cost of all this. What happens to a life when it becomes highly functional, widely approved, and inwardly far away? The cost of functional but absent living. The difficulty with autopilot is not only that it keeps us moving, it is that over time, it can keep us moving away from ourselves. Often, this does not happen in some dramatic, obvious collapse. It happens quietly, gradually, respectably even. A person becomes more efficient, more capable, more adjusted, more socially legible, and more dependable. From the outside, life may look intact, productive, stable, even admirable, and yet inwardly something begins to thin, not all at once, not with a loud announcement, but enough to be felt in certain moments. A strange emptiness after a day that looked successful, a dullness where joy used to reach more easily, a low-grade distance from grief, anger, longing, or fatigue, a sense of being present in the body, but not truly in contact, a life that works but does not always feel lived. That is one of the great costs of functional but absent living. It can take a long time to recognize, precisely because it so often hides beneath competence. If you are coping, people assume you are well. If you are productive, people assume you are engaged. If you are composed, people assume you are settled. If you are still showing up, people assume you are still here in the deeper sense. But function is not the same as intimacy with your own life. When function becomes the measure of health, a person can drift very far from themselves without anyone noticing, sometimes, including themselves. That is where burnout often begins to make more sense. Burnout is not always just overwork. It is not only too many hours, too much demand, too little rest, though of course those things matter. Often burnout is also the cost of sustained self-override, the cost of continuing to perform, produce, care, respond, or remain professionally and socially available long after something more essential in us has begun withdrawing. A person may keep working, keep answering, keep coping, keep appearing fine, while inwardly becoming more and more unreachable, and that unreachability is important. Because one of the deepest harms of autopilot is not merely exhaustion, it is estrangement. Estrangement from desire, estrangement from anger, estrangement from sorrow, estrangement from joy, estrangement from bodily truth, estrangement from the simpler knowledge of what feels right, what feels too much, what feels deadening, what feels alive. When autopilot runs long enough, many people stop feeling clearly enough to know what they want, not because desire has disappeared entirely, but because repeated adaptation has become louder than the quieter signals underneath it. They know how to do what is expected. They know how to keep the routine going. They know how to maintain the role. But ask them what they actually feel, what they need, what they miss, what they long for, what they are angry about, what truly nourishes them, and often there is a pause, not because they are empty, but because self-contact has become unfamiliar. That unfamiliarity can be deeply unsettling. It can show up as numbness, as low-grade detachment, as I don't know, as going blank when the conversation turns inward, being able to discuss responsibilities, logistics, and plans with ease, but feeling strangely distant from the living center of things. Perhaps one of the hardest parts is that many people do not experience this as a clear crisis. They experience it as a vague dissatisfaction, a sense that something is off, a sense that life is being managed rather than inhabited, a sense of being unfulfilled without a clear explanation why. This is often because life itself is not necessarily failing. The job may be stable, the relationship may still be intact, the family role may still be functioning, the responsibilities may still be met, yet the person may feel increasingly absent inside the very life they have built. That absence can create a peculiar grief. A grief without a clear object, a grief for time past half awake, a grief for parts of the self that have gone quiet through over-adaptation, a grief for spontaneity, for directness, for the ability to feel without immediately translating feeling into function. This is where relational distance becomes especially painful, because when we are living on autopilot, we are often not only absent from ourselves, we become absent in our relationships too. We may still be kind, still attentive in practical ways, still reliable, still there on paper, but there can be a difference between being there as a role and being there as presence. A person can become excellent at doing love without always feeling deeply inside it, excellent at supporting others while remaining cut off from their own needs, excellent at staying calm or useful or organized while avoiding the more vulnerable forms of contact that make closeness real. Over time, that can create a strange loneliness, not loneliness because no one is around, but loneliness because the self being met is no longer fully the living self. This is one reason people can feel deeply unseen in relationships where, from the outside, very little seems obviously wrong. They are not unseen simply because the other person is inattentive. Sometimes they are unseen because they themselves have become difficult to reach. They have lived in roles so long that spontaneous self-contact, let alone spontaneous shared contact, feels unfamiliar, risky, or almost impossible. That is a sobering realization. But it is also a humane one, because it reminds us that many forms of emptiness are not failures of character. They are the cost of prolonged adaptation. The cost of becoming highly functional in environments that reward usefulness more than aliveness. The cost of staying in a role when the role no longer reflects the full truth. The cost of surviving by sequence. The cost of managing life instead of inhabiting it, and genuine rest becomes very difficult in that state, because rest is not just the absence of tasks. Rest requires permission to stop performing, permission to stop maintaining the expected self, permission to soften without immediately reorganizing around the next demand. Many people who live on autopilot do not know how to rest deeply, even when they have time. They can stop working, but not stop bracing. They can sit down, but not arrive. They can take a break, but not feel released. They can be off while the system remains quietly on. So rest becomes another activity rather than a real return, and that is when a person may start to realize that the issue is deeper than busyness. It is not only that life is full, it is that contact has become thin. This section matters because it names the emotional cost of that thinning. The cost is not only burnout, it is also deadened joy, muted truth, distant grief, unfelt anger, borrowed identity, private emptiness beneath public capability. It is becoming so adapted that you no longer know, in a simple felt way, what is truly yours. Yet even here, there is something hopeful, because the cost itself is often what begins to wake people up. The boredom that does not make sense, the fatigue that sleep does not fix, the dissatisfaction that success does not resolve, the loneliness inside intact relationships, the sense of being inwardly unreachable. These can all become signals, not that life is over, not that something is irreparably broken, but that something in you is asking to be met more directly. So the cost of functional but absent living is real. It is sobering, but it is not meaningless. Sometimes the emptiness is not just emptiness. Sometimes it is the first honest sign that some part of you no longer wants to live entirely by role, repetition, and adaptation alone. Integration, recognizing when you have left the room inwardly. So where does all of this leave us? If autopilot is more than routine, if roles can become identity, if social life rewards performance, and if a person can become highly functional while inwardly absent, then the real question is no longer simply, do I have habits? The question becomes, can I recognize when a habit has started living in my place? That is where this episode has been leading, not toward the rejection of structure, not toward chaos, not toward some fantasy of living without patterns, roles, or repetition, but toward recognition, because autopilot becomes less total the moment it is noticed. That matters more than it may seem. Many people hear a conversation like this and immediately turn it into judgment. They think, so I've been living unconsciously. I've been fake. I've been absent. I've wasted time. I've become a performer. But that is not the point. The point is not to punish yourself for adapting. The point is to see adaptation clearly enough that it stops being the whole of the story. We all adapt. We all repeat. We all perform in some context. We all have roles. We all have habits. We all know what it is to cope through sequence. The issue is not whether these things exist. The issue is whether they have become so dominant that they now speak in our name. That is the line this episode has been tracing. There is a difference between using structure and disappearing into it. There is a difference between playing a role and becoming trapped inside it. There is a difference between a habit that supports life and a habit that begins replacing direct participation in life. Often the first sign that the line has been crossed is not a catastrophe. It is subtle, a strange thinness, a low-grade absence, a life that works but does not quite feel inhabited, a sense of being reliable but unreachable, a sense that your responses are efficient but no longer fully chosen, a quiet feeling that you are present in body but not always in self. That is why this final integration is about recognizing when you have left the room inwardly. It is a strange phrase, but I think it names something real. You can remain in the room socially, remain in the room professionally, remain in the room physically, remain in the room relationally, at least in appearance, and still inwardly, some part of you may have withdrawn, not dramatically, not always consciously, but enough that life keeps happening on the surface while contact thins underneath. That is what many people miss. They think absence must look like collapse, but often it looks like continuity. It looks like still answering, still showing up, still performing, still coping, still being the one others rely on, still moving the day along, yet the deeper self is no longer fully participating. So the practical question becomes, how do I recognize those moments earlier? How do I notice when a function has replaced contact? How do I notice when a role has become stronger than the living self underneath it? How do I notice when I am repeating a well-rehearsed version of myself instead of actually arriving in the moment? The answer is not through harsher self-analysis alone. It begins with a more honest kind of observation. You start noticing the moments where your responses are too smooth, the moments where your words are available before your presence is, the moments where you can feel yourself performing competence while something quieter in you remains untouched, the moments where you say I'm fine and know inwardly that the phrase is serving continuity more than truth, the moments where your role has answered before your aliveness has had a chance to speak. That kind of observation is not meant to make you self-conscious in an anxious way. It is meant to make you present, because once you can recognize the groove, you are no longer entirely inside it. Once you can recognize that I have left the room inwardly, something shifts. You may not immediately know how to return fully. You may not know how to undo years of adaptation in one moment. You may not even know exactly what being more present would look like yet. But the noticing itself matters. It interrupts the invisibility. It weakens the spell of repetition. It creates just enough inner space for another possibility to emerge. Sometimes that possibility is very little. A pause before the automatic yes. A breath before the professional tone takes over. A moment of truth before the familiar role answers. A quiet acknowledgement, I'm here, but I'm not really here yet. That is not failure. That is the beginning of the return. Because conscious living does not usually begin with a dramatic transformation. It begins with noticing where we have gone automatic, where we have gone procedural, where we have become role-bound. where we have become so adapted that the adaptation now feels like identity, the more honestly that is noticed, the more possible it becomes to ask a better question, not only what am I doing, but who in me is doing the living right now? Is it the caretaker, the strong one, the calm one, the efficient one, the pleasing one, the professional one, the version built for survival, approval, consistency, or usefulness? Or is there actual contact here, actual participation, actual life being lived from the inside? That is the real work of this episode, not to reject identity, but to loosen over-identification, not to destroy the structure, but to make sure the structure has not replaced aliveness, not to shame adaptation, but to stop mistaking adaptation for the whole self, and perhaps that is the most important integration of all. Autopilot is not a moral failure. It is a state of diminished participation that often develops through repetition, usefulness, and social reward, and the way out is not self-contempt. It is recognition. Recognition of where you are most functional and least present. Recognition of which roles you enter too quickly. Recognition of what forms of repetition support you and which ones slowly remove you from yourself. Recognition of the places where you have become excellent at living without fully being there. That is where the episode lands, not in condemnation, not in panic, but in a quieter form of honesty. The honesty to say this works, but it may not be fully alive. This role serves something, but it may not be the whole of me. This pattern is familiar, but familiarity is not the same as truth. I may have been here outwardly, while leaving the room inwardly. That honesty is not the end of the work, but it is where the work becomes real. So this episode has been about a form of absence that is easy to miss because it often looks so competent from the outside. We've looked at autopilot not just as routine, but as repeated ways of being. We've explored how habits become grooves, how roles become identity, how social life rewards consistency over contact, and how a person can become highly adapted while inwardly unreachable. We've looked at professionalism, emotional labor, politeness scripts, gendered role performance, social legibility, and the distance between role competence and inner aliveness. We've looked at the private cost of all of that: burnout, numbness, relational distance, the loss of genuine rest, and the strange emptiness that can grow beneath a life that appears perfectly intact. Through all of it, one thing becomes clearer. Autopilot is not only about what we do repeatedly, it is about what repetition gradually does to us. It can stabilize us. It can support us. But if left unquestioned, it can also begin to replace direct participation in life. That is the sobering truth of this episode. A life can become efficient enough to continue without being deeply inhabited. A self can become coherent enough to function without being fully felt. A role can become polished enough to succeed, while the living person underneath it grows quieter and harder to reach. But the fact that this happens does not mean we are lost. It means we need to recognize where repetition has become stronger than presence. That recognition is already a movement out of autopilot, because once you can see the groove is no longer the whole field. Once you can feel the role taking over, the role is no longer fully invisible. Once you can admit, even quietly, that you have been functioning without contact, contact has already begun to return. That is where episode 4 leaves us, not with a perfect solution, not with a demand to abandon all routine or all identity, but with a more serious awareness of the difference between a life that is merely being managed and a life that is actually being lived. The sliding scale of awareness. In the next episode, we move from autopilot living into something even more foundational: the fact that consciousness is not simply on or off. It is not a switch, it is a spectrum. It expands, contracts, sharpens, fragments, dulls, drifts, and returns depending on what is happening in us and around us, which means that who we seem to be can change dramatically from one state to another. There, we'll explore why you are not equally conscious all day, why awareness changes moment to moment, what narrows it, what widens it, and why the idea of one single stable self is often much more fragile than we imagine. We'll look at how awareness changes across fatigue, illness, attraction, grief, urgency, relief, purpose, and overstimulation. We'll explore what it means to say that who I am often depends more than I realize on what state I'm in, and we'll begin asking a different kind of question, not simply who am I, but who am I in this state, and how different might I be in another? Because once we understand autopilot, we are ready to look more closely at fluctuation, the changing terrain of awareness itself, the fact that consciousness moves, and that is where we go next. To end this episode, I leave you with this. Notice where repetition has started speaking in your name. Notice the role that answers too quickly. Notice the competence that appears before contact. Notice the places where you remain socially present while leaving the room inwardly. Notice the routines that support liveliness and the ones that have quietly started living it for you, because that noticing matters. It is one of the ways awareness returns to the places where habit has grown strongest. One of the ways the living self begins to re-enter the life that has been running on sequence. One of the ways a function slowly becomes present again. Thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to the Consciousness Code podcast episode for Autopilot Living, when habit, identity, and repetition begin living for us. Until next, I'm James Miller.